is the P-38 Lightning. Speed, in excess of 420 miles per hour. Rate of climb, 4,000 feet per minute. Rate of dive, faster than the speed of sound. Armament, 4 50 caliber machine guns and 2 20-millimeter cannons. Bomb load, 2 1,000-pound bombs. Mission. The P-38 performed an astounding variety of missions. Bomber escort, light bomber, close-in air support for ground troops, reconnaissance aircraft. But primarily, the P-38 was a fighter. She was made to close with enemy aircraft and knock them out of the sky. The P-38 is one of those, what shall we call it, masterpieces of technology that beat the odds. Given the nature of the U.S. Army in the post-World War I period, odds that a radical departure in aviation design would be accepted by the conservative Army were overwhelmingly small. But in 1936, the Army, very much aware of how far we were slipping behind Germany and other European powers in the development of fighter aircraft, issued general specifications for a high-altitude interceptor. About that time, there was a young man by the name of Kelly Johnson who had been hired by Lockheed Aircraft Company. Although Lockheed had never built a fighter, they put Kelly Johnson to work meeting the Army's specs. Johnson realized that the time for a radical departure from conventional airframe design had come, and he came to that conclusion for a very simple reason. He had a very good Allison engine to work with, the V-1710, but it wasn't fast enough. If he could put 2 Allisons together, however, they would be fast enough. After playing around with several thoughts, Kelly came upon the idea of putting the pilot's cockpit in the middle of the wing assembly and flanking it with 2 booms. If that wasn't radical enough, Kelly added yet another departure from conventional fighter design and drew tricycle landing gear on his blueprint. To everyone's surprise and relief, the Army awarded a contract to develop a prototype of Johnson's P-38. Lockheed started constructing the Lightning, as it came to be called, in July 1938. Less than 6 months later, the first prototype was delivered to the Air Corps. Lieutenant Ben Kelsey was assigned the mission of testing the P-38 for the Army. Shortly after his first takeoff with the plane, Kelsey got a severe test. The Fowler flap failed and the P-38 was very much out of control. But this is why test pilots are test pilots, and with great skill, Lieutenant Kelsey brought the P-38 in for a safe landing. Even so, a lot of people thought Johnson's folly had come to the end of the road. But the Army again astounded the aviation world by announcing that Lieutenant Kelsey, with less than 6 hours flying time in the ship, would make a high-speed flight across the North American continent in a P-38. On the morning of 11 February 1939, Lieutenant Kelsey took off from Marchfield, California. Seven hours and 43 minutes, 2,490 miles later, he lined up his P-38 for a landing at Mitchell Field, Ohio. But there was a row of trees in his way. As he gunned the twin Allisons to avoid the trees, the right engine failed. The lieutenant had already lowered the landing gear. Kelsey pulled back on the stick, but the landing gear caught the upper branches of the trees. The P-38 slammed into a sand trap of a nearby golf course. Except for his pride, Lieutenant Kelsey was uninjured. Despite the inauspicious ending of the flight, the Army was very impressed with the performance of the P-38. After all, only Howard Hughes had a better cross-country time on record, and his flight was made in a plane specifically equipped for non-stop flight. A contract was issued to Lockheed to produce 13 more Lightnings for the Army. After the P-38, Kelly Johnson stayed on in the airplane design business. In years to come, he would design such famous performers as the C-130 Hercules, the U-2 spy plane, and the SR-71 Blackbird reconnaissance aircraft. Altogether, the P-38 underwent 18 model changes and nearly 10,000 aircraft were produced. P-38s first saw heavy combat action during the North African campaign. After landing troops at Algiers, Oran, and Casablanca, the Allies swept across northern Africa, defeating everything in their path. Algeria and Morocco fell in a matter of days. But Rommel made a stand outside Tunis and fought the Allied offensive to a halt. About this time, the first P-38s arrived in Africa. Elements of the 1st Fighter Group and the 14th Fighter Group arrived within days of each other, and the pilots were very green. The Luftwaffe, on the other hand, had 3 years of aerial warfare under its belt. The initiation of the 1st and 14th was savage. In the first several months of the campaign, losses of planes and pilots were extremely high. Americans were literally learning their tactics as they flew their missions, and paying a high price for inexperience and ignorance. When a new fighter group, the 82nd, arrived in North Africa in midwinter, they were welcomed as long-lost comrades by the pilots of the 1st and 14th. The 82nd brought with them 80 brand-new P-38s. As the green pilots of the 82nd set down for their first time on African soil in their shiny new aircraft, smiling pilots of the 1st and 14th greeted them on the runway and welcomed them into the fraternity of P-38 combat pilots, or so it seemed. But when the pilots of the 82nd got out of those shiny new aircraft, pilots of the 1st and 14th jumped in and flew them to their own bases, never to be seen by the 82nd again. At the time, it was the only way the 1st and 14th could replace their losses. By the time it finally dawned on the 82nd that they had been snookered, half their aircraft were gone. It took them 2 months to recover from their friendly initiation. The 14th, meanwhile, was having a very bad time of it. Between 18 November and 23 January, the group lost half its authorized strength, or 13 pilots and planes. The fact that they were giving the Luftwaffe as good as they got was little consolation. On 23 January, 5 planes from the 14th didn't return from a mission. Remaining pilots refused to fly another mission. Had the 14th disgraced itself by such drastic, some said cowardly action? There was talk of striking the 14th from the rolls of the troop strength of the Army Air Corps. But cooler, wiser heads prevailed. The 14th was taken out of combat and over the next few months refitted with new aircraft. The ground crews were kept intact, but the pilots were dispersed to other fighter groups. By the end of winter, the 14th was back in action and flying with distinction over the skies of North Africa. While the P-38 was getting its baptism by fire in North Africa and southern Europe, the 8th Air Force, headquartered in England, was trying to figure out how to bomb the German homeland without losing its entire fleet of bombers. They could escort the bombers only so far, and at the threshold of Germany, they would have to turn back, leaving the bombers alone in the air. On one such mission, the raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, 325 bombers left England. But even before they crossed the English Channel, German radar had picked them up and sounded the alarm that an Allied armada was on the way. At airfields all over northern Europe, German fighters scrambled. Out of 325 Allied bombers that left for Schweinfurt and Regensburg that day, 60 fell prey to ground fire or the Luftwaffe and never returned home. It was late in 1943 before the Lightning was flying combat missions in Northern Europe. Many had hoped the P-38 would be the answer to the bomber escort problem, but it didn't turn out that way. In fact, the 8th Air Force experience with the P-38 was more on the negative side than the positive. Another problem that plagued the Lightning was the yet unsolved problem of compressibility. The airplane was unstable in a power dive, and therefore unreliable in a dogfight. We had been fighting the war for 2 years, and the problem was still unsolved. Many pilots considered the P-38 a killer. In November 1943, 18 ships were lost, and alarmingly, many of them went down not as a result of enemy fire, but due to mechanical failure. Lockheed put out animated cartoons like these in hopes that better pilot training would eliminate some of the losses. But cartoons didn't solve the problem of compressibility. The addition of a dive flap did. And that was a sad day for German pilots who had perfected the tactic of disengaging a dogfight with the Lightning by simply diving for the deck. Now the P-38 dove after them, and the kill ratios began to climb. One tactic that worked well for the 8th Air Force was using the Lightning as a medium altitude or light bomber. This tactic was called drop snooting. A plexiglass bombardier station was built into the nose of one P-38 in a fighter group, usually the leader's ship. The other planes in the group would follow the leader over a target and drop their bombs on the signal of the bombardier in the leader's plane. Drop snooting worked particularly well against enemy airfields, and a lot of German aircraft were destroyed before they ever got off the ground. To make this tactic even more effective, the 8th initiated a system called jackpot. All of Germany was divided into sectors several hundred miles square. Each fighter group was assigned a sector, and it was responsible for destroying enemy aircraft and aircraft facilities in that sector. Interestingly enough, Allied losses in this kind of operation were 4 times greater than in aerial combat. In May 1944, with the invasion of Northern Europe only a few days away, fighter targets changed from strategic to tactical. The objective was to destroy anything and everything that could support the German armies in France, Belgium, and Holland. Rail movement was a primary means by which Germany moved supplies to its troops. Operation Chattanooga was designed to annihilate German rail operations and permanently cripple German supply lines. The P-38 became a locomotive killer. On the first day of Operation Chattanooga, 91 locomotives were destroyed. Then barge traffic, petroleum yards, truck traffic, all fell under the fire of the P-38. In 3 years, the Allied air war had gone from the last line of defense in the Battle of Britain through a building phase that began to project power against the Axis, to air parity, to air superiority, and by the time we were ready to invade the shores of Normandy, to air supremacy. While we planned for the invasion of France across the Channel in the south of England, men and supplies in numbers never before known in history were gathered in a very small area. This was a tempting target for the Luftwaffe, but not one German plane dared a shot. We ruled the skies. American fighter pilots boasted to the ground troops who were about to invade France, "When you see an airplane in the sky, don't worry, it'll be ours." They kept that promise. This is the day President Franklin Roosevelt said would live in infamy. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. No one can take anything away from the accomplishments of the P-38 in Europe and North Africa. But it was in the Pacific theater that the Lightning came into its own. After the debacle at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese moved quickly to expand and consolidate their position. For most of 1942, Allied forces in the Pacific fought either a holding action or an out-and-out retreat. The Japanese pushed us all the way back to Australia. At the time, the only fighter aircraft available were the P-39 and P-40s, and they had proved no match for Japanese aircraft. Because of the vastness of the Pacific theater, a fighter was needed with both firepower and range. The P-38 was the obvious choice, but there were very few available. General George Kenney, commander of Allied air forces in the Pacific, begged the Pentagon for P-38s. Late in 1942, he got 16 P-38s, and those had to be modified. But the ground crews went to work, and it wasn't long before the Japanese received a very abrupt introduction to the fighter they called Lightning. It happened in late December 1942. Intelligence reported a flight of enemy aircraft approaching Dobodora on the north side of New Guinea. 12 Lightnings took off to intercept the enemy planes. When contact was made, the Americans broke down into 3 flights of 4 planes and attacked the Japanese. When the battle was over, 11 Japanese fighters and bombers were destroyed. The P-38 had arrived in the Pacific. Although the P-38 had more range than any other fighter in the Pacific at the time, there was one man around who thought by applying the right techniques, even more miles could be coaxed out of the Lightning. That man, even though he was a civilian, had all the credentials anyone needed to teach long-distance solo flight. The man was none other than Charles Lindbergh. After flying with the P-38s, Lindbergh suggested a few things, and the pilots put those ideas to the test. Not so surprisingly, they worked, and added significantly to the success of the P-38 in the Pacific. In April of 1943, a bold mission was conceived by Colonel John Mitchell of the 339th Fighter Squadron to shoot down the Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Imperial Navy, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Because of the extended ranges needed for this unique mission, the P-38s participating in the raid were modified for long-distance flight. Lindbergh's tips were about to pay off. Colonel Mitchell narrates his own story.
We took off from Guadalcanal. I was leading the flight. We knew that he would be in a Betty-type bomber and that he would be escorted by Zeros. When I made landfall, I was about 1 minute ahead of the time that I had planned to be there, which was rather incredible when you think about it, because it was, as I said, I had no checkpoints, anything else all the way up there, so it was unbelievable almost that we happened to be there at the time we were. I knew that we had our man. I knew that we had him. So, of course, as soon as this happened, we got the hell out of there because the mission was accomplished.
In March of 1943, an American reconnaissance aircraft spotted a convoy of Japanese ships moving in the Bismarck Sea towards New Guinea. There were still only a handful of P-38s in the Pacific, but they were anxious to show what they could do against any target. "162 American and Australian pilots descended on the Japanese convoy in the Bismarck Sea. At a cost of only 6 Allied aircraft, the convoy was decimated, and an entire division of Japanese troops was crossed off the situation maps of the Pacific theater. One of the pilots involved in these first battles in the Pacific was a young flyer from Butler, Wisconsin by the name of Richard Bong. Soon after graduating from flight training and being commissioned a second lieutenant in 1942, Lieutenant Bong reported for duty at Darwin, Australia. He was assigned to the 39th Fighter Squadron, an outfit that flew P-38 Lightnings. If ever man and machine belonged together, it was the P-38 and Dick Bong. In a very short time, he let the Japanese know he was in the Pacific by downing 8 of their aircraft. He was transferred to the 49th Fighter Group and soon became leader of the 9th Fighter Squadron. As Allied forces pushed the war in the Pacific back towards the Japanese mainland, Dick Bong flew cover for light and heavy bombers, taking on Vows, Zeros, Oscars, Tonys, Tojos, everything the Japanese put in the air against him. In November 1943, a recon aircraft from the 8th Photo Squadron flying over Simpson Harbor saw 7 Japanese destroyers and 20 merchant vessels. And at the airdromes around the base at Rabaul, they had counted 237 planes. The pilots were briefed. The plan was for a force of B-25 Mitchells and P-38 Lightnings to strike Rabaul simultaneously. Surprise and timing were the key ingredients of the plan. It had to be a well-coordinated attack, or disaster awaited the Americans. For Rabaul was the hub of the Japanese thrust into the Pacific, and it was heavily fortified and ringed with anti-aircraft weapons. Six squadrons of Mitchells and 6 squadrons of Lightnings took off for Rabaul. Richard Bong was one of them. Japanese planes were in the air waiting for the American armada of 160 planes as they approached Rabaul. While the bombers kept going, the Lightnings peeled off and tore into the Japanese interceptors. After shredding the interceptors, the P-38 savagely attacked their assigned targets on the ground. Then they attacked shipping in Simpson Harbor. The fury lasted 12 minutes. And when it was over, 41 enemy ships had been bombed or strafed, and 94 enemy aircraft had been destroyed. P-38s and aerial dogfights had shot down 42 Japanese fighters. The cost? 17 planes down, 45 Americans dead. It was a big day for the Americans. By now, Richard Bong had 28 confirmed kills in the air. He was America's top ace. It was time to go home for a well-earned rest. But that's not all. It was time for more schooling in the States also. In April 1944, the flying ace from Butler, Wisconsin, entered advanced gunnery school. After graduation, Bong returned to Australia, now to teach what he knew so well, how to defeat Japanese pilots in aerial combat. But Dick Bong was not the only pilot who knew how to knock Japanese planes out of the sky with a P-38. The 457th Fighter Group had a young captain by the name of Tommy McGuire. A tremendous rivalry developed between Bong and Tommy McGuire over who would be America's top air ace. In the battle for Leyte, the Japanese held one end of the island, while Allied forces built a foothold on the other end. Day and night, the Japanese threw the best of their air force against Allied positions on the island. Dick Bong and Tommy McGuire were there. And although Bong didn't have to fly another combat mission, he was now a training officer, he climbed into a P-38 and flew mission after mission against the Japanese fighters. During this battle, Major Bong raised his score of kills on Japanese aircraft to 38. Tommy McGuire came out of the battle with 30 kills. Then on December 12, 1944, General MacArthur gathered an honor guard of 12 pilots, each with 12 or more air combat kills to his credit. And as his fellow aces looked on, the general pinned the nation's highest military decoration, the Congressional Medal of Honor, on Dick Bong's chest. The citation read in part, "Though assigned to duty as gunnery instructor and neither required or expected to perform combat, Major Bong voluntarily and at his own request engaged in repeated combat missions, including unusually hazardous sorties over Balikpapan, Borneo, and in the Leyte area of the Philippines." As if this wasn't enough, Major Bong continued to fly combat missions against the enemy, and it wasn't long before he had kills number 39 and 40. After more than 2 years in the Pacific theater, hundreds of missions, endless eternities of aerial combat against enemy pilots, in January 1945, Major Richard Bong, America's top ace, returned to the United States where a hero's welcome had been prepared for him. But back in the Pacific, Captain McGuire was closing in on Bong's record. Not wanting to spoil Dick Bong's ceremony in the States by having him learn on the reviewing stand that he was second best, General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, grounded Tommy McGuire till after Bong's ceremony. On January 7th, Kenney turned McGuire loose. McGuire had 38 kills. He needed 2 to tie Bong, 3 to become America's premier ace. McGuire took off on a recon mission near Negros Island. Suddenly, he saw a Japanese plane flying right at him. Before he could fire, the plane passed beneath him and went into a steep turn at 300 feet. McGuire was slightly above him, and as he tried to tighten his turn, his lightning stalled out. Then McGuire shifted a snap roll, ending up in an inverted position with his nose down at a 30-degree angle. It happened so fast, the way most things did in a fighter pilot's life. Seconds later, McGuire slammed into the ground and exploded. For his brilliant combat record, Captain Thomas McGuire was awarded a posthumous Congressional Medal of Honor. Stories about the P-38 are endless. This presentation has only scratched the surface. P-38s got into a fight with the Russians over Yugoslavia. The Russian army was advancing against a German withdrawal. The Russians hadn't told the Americans they were moving. American P-38 pilots saw troops, thought they were German, and attacked. Russian Yak fighters protecting the Red Army attacked the Lightnings, shooting 2 of them down. The Americans dispatched 2 Yaks to Earth in flames. Finally, both sides realized they were shooting at friendly forces and contact was broken. This incident remained classified for many years. No matter where it flew, over North Africa, the Mediterranean, Northern Europe, over the Burma Hump, or the vast stretches and endless skies of the Pacific, the P-38 made an outstanding contribution towards defeating the enemy and shortening the war. The Germans called her the fork-winged devil. We called her lightning. Those who flew her were men off of every city street and country road in America. Here was truly a remarkable phenomenon, a radical aircraft design married to the American common man. Together they went to war against the enemies of freedom and won.